On the day of the coup, I was at that point teaching English. I'd gotten a job. I had come to Chile as with a grant from the Inter-American Press Association for 9 months, and that was expiring. And so I wanted to stay on, and so I got a job teaching English at the Grange School, which is a very fancy English type school. And so I was going to go to work. I got up that morning and was on my way to head out to the school. My girlfriend went to class. She left earlier. And as I was about to come out the door, she comes back and says, it's happening. The coup is happening. This is probably 9 o'clock in the morning. And so we went back in, started listening to the radio, and we heard, I can't remember how we'd know these things. It's like you didn't have any phones. You didn't have any internet to know what was going on. Somehow we knew things were going on. And I knew that Radio Magallanes was the only radio station that was still on the air. I tuned into Radio Magallanes, and very quickly Allende comes on the air and gives his speech. In the meantime, I got my tape recorder and I recorded the speech, which I have in the bookshelf right over there. I've always kept that tape. And he gives this incredible speech in which he does not call on people to take up arms. He does not tell people to sacrifice themselves. He says, in fact, do not. He talked about the future. He talked about a time when it's hard, even so long afterwards, to think of the enormous disappointment, right? The loss of hope of something you had believed in. He spoke of a time in the future when men, he didn't say men and women, we now change it, would again come down the Alameda and would bring the social order that would solve poverty, and that moment will come, but not now. And we didn't want to believe that, so I lived in a house with 7 other people, Chileans and internationals, and we had been told that the place to go is the cordones industriales, the industrial belt where the workers are organized. And so we just took off walking. And from our house in Ñuñoa to Vicuña McKenna Street was about 3/4 of a mile, not very far. And then another straight shot of about 1.5 miles, we went back to the same place that I'd been there before, to the Luchetti factory, where I knew that there were workers that were organized. And on the way, there were trucks coming full of soldiers. Vicuña McKenna is a very important artery coming from the north, right into the center of town. Coming from the south, going north. On the other side of town, you have mountains. You have enormous hills, not the main Andes Mountains, but very large hills. So access to the city is really not from the north, it's from the south. Trucks full of soldiers were driving, not in a convoy. They were like isolated trucks, but they were full of soldiers with their weapons. I remember they had armbands on their uniform. Supposedly they were worried that other soldiers would oppose them and they wouldn't know who was on their side and who wasn't, so they all had marked themselves. Those soldiers just were driving 30, 40 miles an hour toward the center of town. They didn't stop. They were worried that they were going to get shot at, I think, which of course didn't happen. So that's the only sign of the military that we saw. We went to the factory and we're told the workers pretty much have gone home. Resistance is not happening. This is not, this is not a reliable source. I mean, but this is what you gather by talking to all the people around. The consensus was there's not going to be any significant resistance from this factory or from other ones. And so we headed back home. And on the way back home, we're going on this street toward the center of town, and we're looking off to the south, toward the center, and we see smoke rising from the center of town. And that was the Moneda, which had been bombed and was now burning. The Moneda Palace where Allende was. So, you know, then we went home and to this house where 8 people lived, all of us young people relatively, all in our 20s and 30s, and 5 more people showed up thinking that our house was safer than wherever they were. May or may not have been true, but so there were people that came in I didn't even know, a friend of a friend supposedly, and then they announced that there was a curfew. Nobody could leave the house. I think it was like 5 o'clock or something like that. From that point on until further notice, right? So the whole next day we were under curfew. We couldn't leave the house. And then it was lifted, I think, on Thursday. During that time we were pretty terrified in the house, listening to the radio. We didn't have a TV. And there were bandos, they were decrees read over the radio, ordering all the officials of the Popular Unity government to turn themselves in. And the most frightening thing was on that first day, an announcement that there are thousands of foreign extremists in the country who have come here to kill Chileans. We will give them no quarter. They must turn themselves in if they are in situación irregular. In other words, your papers are not in order, which there weren't very many people who didn't have a visa because visas were easy to get. We understood that applied to all of us, that if you're a foreigner, I didn't think I had to turn myself in, but I did feel that then the next part of the announcement was, loyal Chileans, be alert. When you see foreign extremists, turn them into the nearest police station. So they were inviting the Chileans to denounce foreigners, and we got raided 3 days later. And many foreigners' houses got raided, including Frank Tarugi, who's my friend, and Charles Horman. That's another story, but they were the 2 Americans who were killed. 800 foreigners were rounded up in those early days, 800. And 50 approximately, actually 49, were killed, that according to my research. The razzia, the rampage against foreigners, the xenophobia was so radical, it was so mean, it was so hateful, that it was their attempt to blame foreigners for what was happening. The Cubans, the Uruguayans who had been, there were probably at least 12,000 exiles from all over Latin America that had come to Chile. And they were doing political work. They were not just, I mean, it was safe, they thought, but it was also a base for their political activity to hopefully restore democracy or make a revolution back in their own country, right? The Tupamaros in Uruguay had just been soundly defeated in 1972 and 1973. Thousands of Uruguayans had come. There were also many thousands of Brazilians because Brazil was under a dictatorship. Also, Bolivia, which is right across the border, had been the traditional leftist ally of the Chilean left. Che Guevara's followers in the ELN were so numerous and so important in the Socialist Party that there was a wing of the party called the ELN. They were called Helenos, and they were the followers of Che Guevara, not literally, but it was like the left wing of the left-wing party. The foreign presence was very important, and the foreign it was an international. People thought of themselves as part of an international revolution. With, of course, it was totally Chilean, but it was in the context of something that will spread to the rest of Latin America. In the optimistic earlier days, if this is successful, then the idea that you can create a revolution, solve social problems, have an economy that serves people rather than corporations and the rich, that will spread to the rest of Latin America. And so everybody thought of this as an international event. And of course, the coup itself was an international event with lots of international influences. But the consensus of the coup itself was it was expected, but nobody expected it was going to be a massacre. People thought it would be a coup similar to other coups in Latin America. I mean, Uruguay had a military coup. There was still a civilian president, but he was now an ally of the military. There was no Congress. They rounded up many people. Thousands of people were in prison, but very few people were killed. There were no shootings on the street. And Argentina had a series of military coups, takeovers, since the 1960s. And of course, sometimes people died, but that was the norm, right? That was the thing that you could expect. What happened in Chile was, I don't think that there's a precedent in Latin America. It was mass killing. It was mass raids on people's houses all over the city, particularly poor people's poblaciones, poor people's areas. Raids on these factories, all these factories. These were the centers of Allende's strength, and so they were the targets of the army. And I've tracked this almost day by day, what they were doing. We in the city, we were the least of their worries. They got around to raiding individual houses in the following week. But what they were doing those first days was, particularly during that curfew period, when nobody could leave their house. So you were in effect trapped in your house. If you were out on the streets, you could be shot. You were in your house. Everybody was where they would go to the centers of resistance. They knew where they were, and everybody was at home. And that's when they did mass arrests. 7,000 people were rounded up in Santiago in the first 2 weeks. And most of them put in the Estadio Nacional, the national soccer stadium. And the killing was, a lot of killing, people, bodies on the street. Friends of mine said they saw somebody saw one hanging from a pole. People would see somebody, you'd be in a bus and there would be a body on the side of the street. There were bodies in the Mapocho River, which is famous because that is one of the images that is endured, is associated with with the events of the coup. Of course, the military denied having done any of this stuff, right? Except occasionally they would say that somebody tried to escape and so he was killed while escaping, right? But generally they denied all of this killing. But people knew that the people had been killed because the bodies were there to be seen. So the people knew that this is what the military is doing to those who supported Allende. And any resistance that, in case you were thinking about it, will be met in the same way. So that's the definition of terror, right? It's not just cruelty, it's cruelty with the intention of conveying a message that this is what will happen to you. So that was my experience of the days of the coup. They were pretty grim. A lot of this stuff we didn't know about until afterwards. I mean, of course, this is based on my research over the years that I have a much clearer picture of it. You know, at the time, we were just trying to piece together in the days after the coup, when we finally were able to leave our house, try to talk to people, but you were afraid to talk to people because they knew that they were following, they're trying to see where people were going to join together, and then they would raid those places. My roommate, my housemate, Alcibiades, was a student at the Escola Latina, which is an economics school on the Calle Cóndor. And he went as soon as he could, he went back to the school because he wanted to know what was happening, you know, can I resume my classes, etc. It's a master's program. And they raided it. So they waited till everybody came back into their schools, then they raided them and took them in prison, and they would sort out who they wanted to keep, and then they would release the rest. But they released him after curfew. So after midnight, he is pushed out into the street at the Escuela Militar, which is on Apoquindo. And he has to find his way home after curfew when they're killing people who are out after curfew. And so he's going door to door. He gets home at 5 in the morning, jumps over the gate, and is finally safe. That was my experience of the experience of terror that so many people were living through.